Okay, we're back. We're live. We're here. It's kind of the end of the day today on given Tuesday. Today this evening, we're talking about community matters, public space concepts in Hawaii with Fritz Johnson. He's an architect down the block. He's like 2 minutes away. Hi, Fritz.
When I'm running.
Nice job. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Okay, and just as a way of getting started, ThinkTech does Twitter. Our Twitter handle is ThinkTech Hawaii HI. Tweet us at ThinkTech High. Send us your questions and comments. We'll discuss them on the air. We want to hear what you have to say. After all, ThinkTech is about civic engagement. So send us a tweet today at ThinkTech High HI. We're here for you. Also, I want to mention that on May 21, we're having this great program at Laniakea. It's a lunch and panel program. It goes 11:30 for lunch, 12 noon for the program. It ends at 1:30. And it's going to be very interesting. We now have 8 panel members. Are you kidding me?
Do you know that many people?
Yeah, I do know that many people. I've been working on it, and it shows you how much you can do in only a very short period of time. So, and guess what? Fritz Johnson is one of the 8 people. And so we're going to discuss with him, the concept of the program here and warm him up and warm me up for exactly what we're going to discuss. So, sort of give you an idea about what we have in mind for this program. We're in a time when the rail is being built. We're in a time when Kaka'ako is being built, really built. We're in a time when people have expectations for a new urban center in the Kaka'ako.
I've been there.
I get it, yeah. And vis-a-vis rail, covering the whole southern part of the island here. And so we need to think about planning. We need to think about public spaces. That's part of planning. And we haven't really much. I'll ask Fritz about that. So the question is, how important is that? How important is public spaces? Now, all this is fomented by the fact that just last weekend, the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, conducted a tour of the downtown historic buildings and spaces. And so we walked around and saw some of them. And, did you go on that, Fritz?
No.
It was very interesting in the sense that there weren't that many public spaces. If you Google the term public space, you get an extraordinary number of beautiful photographs and the like of public spaces around the world. And you say to yourself, gee, I haven't seen anything like that in Hawaii. I haven't seen anything like those public spaces. Now, the other thing is that there seems to be, I'm going to ask Fritz about this too, there seems to be a movement on the mainland, and I don't know if you could call him the leader, but there's one guy who's writing and talking about it a lot. His name is Michael Kimmelman. Kimmelman is he's the architecture critic for the New York Times. He's actually a fine artist, but turned into an architecture critic. And he's been speaking, in the university speaking circuit on the East Coast about public spaces from, the beginning of public spaces in the old Greek and Roman days to now, and sort of a revival of interest in public spaces in New York and other places on the mainland, I guess, all over the mainland. And the question is, is Hawaii aware of that? Is Hawaii, following it? Is Europe aware and following? And I think from Kimmelman's remarks, it is. And I don't know about Asia, but I think Asia is probably aware of it and following. And so, this goes to one of ThinkTech's main themes, and that is, are we being progressive? Are we keeping up? Are we avoiding backwater? Are we establishing a way of life here that will attract people and keep our kids? And somehow part of that is the way we deal with public spaces. So, Fritz, based on your training and 29,000 years of experience, what's a public space?
Well, I'm just going to go back into the past 9,000 years. And public space can have several different meanings, because it can be, park areas for active or passive recreation. They can be park areas for pathways and communications and transportation between different areas of subdivisions and even cities and different communities within a city. Public spaces can be Mauna Kea, the Poly Highway. I mean, there's a lot of things that can fall under that. I think primarily the concerns today are the public spaces that directly affect people, where they live, how they communicate, how they circulate back and forth and how it affects them directly in their own lifestyles.
Yeah. I heard Kimmelman say in one of his remarks that public space, he said he got up from his apartment and he walked out the door in Manhattan and he saw this on the street corner and he saw that on the street, and he went to the train or the bus or drove his car or whatever it was up to some speech he was giving in Connecticut. And when he got there, he made a note to himself that everywhere he had been, between his apartment and the venue for his speech, was a public space. So, you could take that as a definition of whatever's not a private space is a public space.
Well,
it's a lot of space.
The front door to my office is definitely a public space.
Let the record reflect that Purchase office is on King Street in Chinatown.
So it's very public down there.
Okay.
And you're right. There's, I mean, as soon as you step out of your private domain, everything else is sort of public space. And whether it's concrete or grass or sidewalks or homeless people.
Yeah. So, yeah, and we should break that down too. But so the question is, are we interested in all of that? Is the profession of architecture interested in all of that?
Well, I think architects should definitely be totally interested and very involved with open space in how it connects and opens up within communities and connects communities. And it's not just the green space. I think it's the social space and the urban spaces that are connected and how they're connected. And then you have to do a certain amount of background and history and forward thinking about how is the space used now and how is it maybe going to be used 25 or 30, which is a short period of time. The Scandinavian countries still in Europe are so far advanced than we are in how they communicate with their open space, and to a certain extent England.
What do you mean communicate?
Well, in Sweden, Norway, Helsinki, in Finland and Denmark particularly, they're all very closely knit related. But their cities are connected with open green public spaces. And that goes from the winter through the summer. They ice skate on them in the wintertime, they connect, they communicate, they travel between each other. And in the summertime, on the lakes and the waters and the Baltic Sea. But when you get in between the communities, you can go from your neighbor's house to your neighbor's house without crossing, a major street. You can go to the shopping center. They have underpasses, they have overpasses, they have playgrounds, they have ways to connect everybody, one community with another with a green space. So you always feel like you have some open space, you have some recreation space, you have passive space, and in these spaces there'll be active playgrounds, there'll be passive playgrounds, there'll be major playgrounds. They have hot air balloons there all the time. They really use their open space, and of course they don't live on an island. So they have a little bit more space and less population that we have here. But I can't think of too many places here where you can go from here to your neighbor's house or to the shopping center without crossing 3 major highways, going through 10 stoplights and then trying to find a place to park.
Yeah, you can't walk or run
Right.
easily anyway, or cycle for that matter. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I mean, if you start with, tell me if I'm wrong about this, this is sort of classical architectural education, but it started in Greece and Rome, where people built plazas and open spaces for congregating, for having political experiences. And by the way, only citizens could go in those spaces. And citizen was defined a lot differently then than it is now. And then, of course, that spread, right? The Roman and Greek tradition spread all the way to Scandinavia. And it's all over continental Europe.
All down into Africa, all the way up in England. The Roman Empire had a huge impact. And like you say, a lot of their public spaces weren't so public. They were public for the people that were invited or could afford to use them,
Yeah.
At the time. But a lot of them were hardscapes, too. It wasn't
What's
like
a hardscape?
the cement, stone, their green spaces outside the city and in the villas were fairly substantial, but that was kind of for the elite.
Yeah.
The poor people had to travel outside the city, and most of them were outside the city anyway. And then there's a lot of open space. Yeah. But it wasn't, I think, like you say, it was more for political use and reality and than it was for public spaces. And with the Coliseum and the Forum and everything else. It was.
It made life interesting for sure, and it was a way that you could engage with your friends or maybe the public and do things, keep occupied, watch gladiators, whatever it was. Then you look at England, and I'm only seeing England because I think England has a special kind of style, special consciousness about open spaces, public spaces, which actually was transmitted to the Commonwealth countries like Canada and Australia, because they have a lot of open spaces, and they really do keep their cities open.
And clean.
Yes,
I mean,
yes,
you know, that part, some places of Europe aren't so clean, but most of them were very conscientious about cleanliness and keeping, their parks clean, and I mean, their buildings and school. There's a wastebasket, 10 wastebaskets on every street block there. You've always got a place to put something in, either to recycle it or not. And you'd mentioned earlier too, they have bikeways, they have jogging ways, they have playways. They really have thought ahead on how to physically communicate and live outdoors. And part of it there too is they can only live outdoors 3 or 4 months out of the year comfortably in the summertime. And so, the whole country lives outside. And then in the wintertime, if you're of course athletic, everyone's jogging, and mothers take their strollers out, and to go along with that, when a woman gets pregnant, she automatically get a year off from work, paid work, and that can be divided up between the husband and the wife.
That's very healthy, isn't it?
The husband can take 6 months or 3 months. The buses are free. All public transportations are free. And so you'll see as many fathers out in the public spaces as the mothers are. And it's not mandatory. They have the option to do that, and everybody does it there.
That's not a bad thing at all.
And in England, when they first started really seriously thinking about their social and urban planning and open spaces right after the war, because a lot of the countries were pretty much destroyed, the cities and stuff. And so they would plan new cities, and they would plan for the schools and the daycares and the colleges, and they would actually plan for the young people coming out that were going to start up and start working. So they would all move out into the bedroom communities. And they were very healthy and very active, and they started having kids. And then the kids started to grow up, and they went to high school. But when they graduated, there was no one else to go to high school. The high school sat empty. They went away to go to college. Then the high schools were empty, and then they got better jobs than what they had in the community that was designed for business and tech about 25, 30 years ago. They started moving into the bigger cities, and pretty soon these bedroom communities kind of became housing, low-income housing. They couldn't get people to fill up the spaces. And so there's a lot of things they didn't think about that far down the road. And I get the same feeling here in Hawaii. We don't think that far into the future. Before
we get into that, this is a good time for a break. I'd like to talk about the U.S. in general, and then Hawaii in contradistinction. That's Fritz Johnson. He's an architect for many years here in Honolulu. We're on community matters, because community does matter. We're talking about public space concept in Hawaii in anticipation of the public space discussion we'll have at Laniakea on May 21, and Fritz is on the panel there. We'll be right back after this short break.
This is Alice Lee Hagan, host of ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My show here at ThinkTech Hawaii is every Thursday from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. I bring in interesting guests from Hawaii, the mainland, and hopefully international guests in the future. Do join us on Thursday from 3 to 4 p.m. ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. Aloha.
Students from kindergarten through 12th grade are learning to a higher standard. The Hawaii Common Core defines clear learning goals that empower students to think critically and apply their knowledge to real-world scenarios. Created with the input of Hawaii's educators, the Common Core prepares students for college, career, and community success, and puts our state closer to reaching our 55% goal.
Help us achieve Hawaii's education goal.
Find out how at 55by25.org.
Aloha, my name is Paul Jackson, better known as PJ, and my local interest is in sports. I have my own sports radio show at KWAI AM 1080 that you can stream live. I also have my own website, pjsportsradio.com. We have live guests in studio, and we talk about discussions and topics that everyone wants to know locally here on the islands. We cover everything from surfing to basketball to whatever's going on locally, sports-wise. We try to do our best and cover the topics in depth as much as we can. Once again, thank you for joining PJ here on Hawaii Sports Update. Mahalo.
Okay, we're back, we're live. We're here with Fritz Johnson having a great time on a Tuesday afternoon, ruminating about the public space concept that ultimately affects us and our program on May 21 here in Hawaii. So, I mean, this whole thing is a kind of interaction between the society and the physical space. And the society creates the physical space, but the physical space also defines the society. And if I turn to the U.S. for a minute, you know, after looking a little at Europe and maybe the Commonwealth, the U.S., you know, what did Tocqueville say? Democracy is tumultuous, and so is the way we deal with our buildings and our cities and our space. And I mean, and in a funny way, there is an art to New York. There's an art to a number of cities. I remember the towpath in Washington.
Yeah.
It's just beautiful. And you know, and Central Park in Manhattan. It's beautiful. Frederick Law Olmsted, you know, gosh, how many years ago? 1850 or so, 1860. And that, you know, that's a long time ago, 160, 70 years ago. So, but the U.S. has not, am I right about this? It has not attended to the planning point you mentioned. It has not well planned these spaces. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but teeming tumultuous democracy has teeming tumultuous cities in large part, and public space is often an afterthought. Am I right?
Well, and when they were planned, being well thought out or not, they really didn't think about the expansion of future growth. And you look at Kapiolani Park, well planned, used to be a racetrack. Horses used to run around there, views to the ocean, views of Diamond Head. And they still have those views, but now they're surrounded by residential condominiums, apartments, and it's an isolated space. Parking is limited. It's limited for the number of views of people that can actually use it at one time. And people are changing, you know, so what they thought was public open space at one time, they may not have such a use for it now. And part of it is the city grows up around these spaces, you know, like Manhattan, and it's still a huge park. It's still a great space, and you look at the skyline and what goes around there. But if you're isolated to a few areas like that, yes, it's public space, but you're not going to get too many of the public people using it. It's just going to, and Kapiolani Park is just totally not overused, but it's maxed out.
Yes, it is. And you know, and one of the speakers on this panel, a guy named Carol Taylor, a lawyer, was effectively the guy who saved Kapiolani Park, because there was a move to commercialize it back in the early 80s, as I recall. And he went to the Supreme Court of the state and saved it. And there was some trust arrangement. He will describe that. It'd be interesting to hear the history of it. Because, I mean, you would have thought that Kapiolani Park would be, you know, an anchor. I mean, a critically important element of the city. And yet there were those who wanted to, you know, make it commercial.
Well, it's kind of like the natatorium as well. You know, I think depending on who you talk to, in your opinion, whether it's a waste of space should be torn down, whether it should stay there in perpetuity or not. But it was totally, you know, the Kapiolani Park was totally tree-lined. You can still see some of the trees on Kalakaua. But it was, you know, it was really well planned out and used, you know, by the elite and the royalty as well as the public. But to see that go, and a lot of our parks are getting infringements out of the little Korean park downtown just off Ala Moana Shopping Center. You go down there now, it's mostly homeless. It's somewhat well taken care of. It's totally in an urban area. I don't see it used by anybody except some of the homeless people.
It's not attractive to the public.
Yeah, so yes, it's nice to have open space, but if that was a soccer park or volleyball or a pool or I don't know what it's going to make it more attractive and more usable, because there's a really strong Asian community in that area. I don't see it being used, and yet it's a public open space.
Yeah, and it's sort of vestigial in its own way.
Yeah.
Had a purpose way back when, but no more. You know, cities change, and that means open spaces have to change, right? Somebody has to get in there and make it organic, dynamic, connected up.
Yeah, it's like, you know, remember when the hand computer was about $900 when you first started
Oh, yeah,
school? You know,
sure.
now you can get 3 for 30 cents. You know, the technology is changing, people are changing. Everything is changing except how people play outside. You know, that pretty much remains consistent, and whether it be it active or passive. So how the parks get used, they also have to appeal to everybody to a certain extent for the use it's going to be used for. You look at Ala Park, it's not safe to go down there at nighttime. Ala Moana Beach Park, it's not safe to go down there at nighttime.
We're losing these spaces.
Yeah, you go down by the Cancer Center, it's...
It's going the same direction, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, I was driving in today, it was, and listening to a song on the radio. It was my favorite song. It's Waikiki. Remember Waikiki? I was always touched by that song. The days of the Hapahauli music down there, and all that romance that people came from around the world. And I listened to that song, and the juxtaposition of that song and the physical, you know, Waikiki now are 1,000,000 miles apart. Waikiki is another place entirely, and it makes the song tear at you. It's a piece of irresistible nostalgia that you wish we could go back to the way it was.
Yeah, it's, yeah, I've lived here maybe 50 years, plus or minus, and the first many years of my life were in Waikiki. It was a fun place. It was gregarious, it's active. The tourists, you know, and the locals mixed, you know, whether it was surfing, boogie boarding, body surfing, just laying on the beach. Remember they had all those little trellises there, and everybody would come down there and they would play cribbage, they'd play backgammon, they'd play checkers, they'd play all kinds of board games. It was they played volleyball down at the natatorium, 3, 4 games at a time. And all that is gone now.
Yeah.
And it seems like the economics and the politics tend to take over.
Also amnesia. The amnesia takes over. I think people forget the way it was, or they, you know, for some reason they reject it. And then you look again and you hear the song and you realize it's gone.
Well, I don't think we forget it so much, you know, so much as it's not there anymore. So it doesn't flash back in your memory.
Yeah.
But part of that is the changing times. And if you have valuable property and it's on the beachfront, you know, unless you got some really strong, positive people, motivation and planning ahead of time, San Diego's maintained their boardwalk fairly well. Santa Monica has kind of maintained theirs fairly well. And they find, and we found this in architecture too, and especially again in the Scandinavian countries, good architecture, good design, and good public spaces actually add value to the spaces you're living in. And so does good architecture.
Well, you know, that's the thing. I mean, somebody should be out there. I don't know who it is, and I think it's kind of a vacuum in our society, watching this stuff. The full title of the program, by the way, is Public Spaces in Hawaii, planning them, designing them, funding them, managing them, maintaining them, and preserving them. And you have to do all those things. It doesn't happen by magic. None of that happens by magic. Somebody has to watch over it. And it's government, but it's also the architectural profession in its own way.
And you know, the planners, the urban planners, the landscape architects, the architects, you know, they should all be working in conjunction with each other, not in isolation in Kapolei, not in isolation in Waikiki, not on the other side of the island. But no one's going to be clairvoyant. But you should be able to make a space, because Kapiolani Park is now full of soccer players and you know, very active games, and that takes up a lot of space.
Yes, it does.
So you don't get a lot of picnic out there during the softball.
You used to, though, didn't you? You used to. There's all kinds of other activities going on.
There was, you know, there was a lot of stuff. They had the archery lane, which probably a little bit more dangerous now than it was then. But you know, people, when they had the concerts at the Shell, the park was half filled up with people listening to the concert. You don't have room to do that anymore. And so somehow you got to plan that it's not always going to be a horse track, it's not always going to be tennis. They had miniature golf. I mean, the city and county had a golf driving range there for a while. So it's got to be flexible, you know.
Yeah, but you know, the thing is, it's got to have points of interest. I mean, for example, not the same as Kapiolani Park, but I remember in New York when I was in school, they would block off certain blocks on a given Saturday or Sunday, and they would allow these craft merchants to come in and sell you trinkets and hats and T-shirts and whatever, and then there would be food there, okay? And I mean, that was fabulous. You could spend the whole day walking from block to block, no traffic, and just looking at what these vendors had to offer you. And it was so much fun with the benches and the people and the food and the stuff to buy. It was romantic to the nth degree. There's nowhere that I can think of in Hawaii where you can do that. There's no place that's really interesting that will draw me. You know, Eat the Street, you know, the thing that goes on in Kaka'aka was
Right.
a great risk of ending. It was a moment in time where we enjoyed it, but I think it's going to go away probably. What is left? You can't, you know, it's not the stadium swap meet. That's not it.
Well, and the farmers markets in the different parking lots and stuff, and they draw people, but they draw it more for a need, you know, and Fort Street Mall is about the closest thing we have to a walking
Yes,
street.
that's true, yeah.
But it doesn't have that street flavor like the old vending streets.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know what they were called then, but they were like malasadas in New York on the Lower East Side, and they would be boiling them in these big pots. And they would be cooking pastas, and then you'd get to the Greek part of town and the Chinese part of town. And it was a total cultural experience, and the smells. And I used to play stickball down on Henry Street. You know, I think you'd take your life in your own hand now to try and do that.
Right, don't do that.
And Murphy's does that sometimes. You know,
Yeah,
he'll close off one or two streets down there and make it a big public thing and has events. And I think he's a very strong influence and draw to that part of Chinatown.
Because of that.
Yeah.
Because of first, what is it, first night of the month and all that? It's a very good idea, but it isn't played out as to the extent that it should be played out.
It's a good idea, and it doesn't seem like it gets followed through. I mean, really a big bang, like the movies at the beach in Waikiki.
Yeah.
You know, they had all the movie stars coming down and introducing and people to line up. But if you can't get the people there, and it seemed to be a very tourist-orientated thing, because locals had a hard time finding a place to park and get down there. But they seem to spark off really good, and they just kind of fade away.
They do, because nobody follows through
Yeah.
on them. You know, one of the places that we visited on this architectural tour was Financial Plaza of the Pacific. I'm not sure where they picked this place. I never thought too much of that building. And in front of and by the way, a woman named Tonia Moy, an architect with Fung and Associates, was the station keeper to explain what was going on over there. One of the things to me is if you make a public space, even if it's a private public space, you know, even with just a public easement, you want to make it interesting. You want to make it possible for people to sit, enjoy, you know, have lunch, watch the pigeons, whatever it is. That includes pigeons of all kinds. and you know, you look at Financial Plaza of the Pacific. It is an abject failure.
Right.
There's nothing happening there.
And it's new, relatively new.
Yeah.
You look at Chinatown in the daytime, it's packed. I mean, everyone's shopping down there, and they've got private public spaces down there. They're public spaces, but they're walking streets.
Yeah.
And you can't drive through there comfortably. I mean, because everybody goes down there. And there's something about the old flavor of, I don't care, any community that keeps that, people go there. And yes, they serve a purpose there as well. But I'll walk down there just to walk around and see what's going on.
Yeah. We're going to take another break. Fritz Johnson, architect, right down the street, here on Community Matters, because community does matter. We're talking about public space concepts in anticipation of the luncheon panel program we're going to do with Fritz on May 21st at Laniakea. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Ethan Allen. I host Likeable Science on ThinkTech Hawaii, and I do this because I care about science literacy in Hawaii. I want to spread the understanding that science is a vital and interesting part of everyone's life. I want to make sure the broadest possible spectrum of people understand the beauty and the value of science and realize that science plays out each and every day of their lives. I want you to understand that science is fun. So we bring on to this show each week guests who are scientists, from astronomers to zoologists, and we talk about what they do and how they do it. But most importantly, we talk about why you should care about their work, why you should see that their work has value and impact on your life. So I hope you'll join us Fridays, 1 p.m. here on ThinkTech Hawaii. You can watch us via live stream. You can watch us recorded on Olelo, and you can see us each week. We hope you'll join us.
Okay, we're live, we're back. We're here with Fritz Johnson, architect, right down the block, on community matters, public space concepts as they apply in Hawaii. So you're talking about those little lanes that you find in Europe, makes things so interesting, so exciting, little shops, little tiny shops. You spend your whole day doing that. There's a psychic enjoyment that's hard to describe, walking down a little twisted lane. You know?
And whether you're an architect or not, everybody enjoys,
Yeah.
you know, those windy little streets and the arches, the bricks. Some have been plastered over, some of the plaster's falling off.
Yeah.
Selling, you know, breads and baguettes and wine and even tourist kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Everybody loves going there. It's a fun place. And I'd mentioned a bit earlier that in Salt Lake City, the streets were really wide, boulevards, but they were designed because they thought ahead of time and wanted to be able to turn the horses and carriages around on the streets. And so they have some very nice wide public streets there. And we was talking a little bit about Roman Empire. Their streets were wide enough for the chariots to go down, and you can still see a lot of the ruts in the streets. And then they got wider for the streetcars, and you can see in a lot of them the old streetcar tracks that aren't even there anymore. So there's spaces that can still become very much alive and retain their vitality. But, and I'd mentioned a little bit in Chinatown, in the daytime, it's packed. You know, cars are double parked on the street, everybody's shopping, everybody's walking around down there. Some of the streets are closed off and they're specific market streets, and they really have a vitality of their own. And if you think of what we have in Hawaii to work with, you know, Chinatown is one of the spaces, but I think the Alawai Canal is a phenomenal chance to do something. And it would take you from Diamond Head all the way down, you know, to the yacht club.
Who should do it?
I think it should be it should be a combination of obviously of architects and planners and landscape people and business people, but you don't want to turn it into not that I love Manhattan, you know, and the streets they have there, but you don't want to turn it into a commercial space that feels like downtown, any downtown. I mean, the one thing about a waterway, you know, and it's used by the canoes there, you're not going to get to build over it. You know, it's going to be there. You think of the Vecchia in Venice.
Ponte Vecchio, yeah, sure.
And so those kind of spaces, they just live on forever. And we have an opportunity to expand public. Right now, you got to go up and down the sidewalks. And if you jog and get too close, you're going to fall into that canal that needs to be cleaned up, you know, or bicycles. But if you had something, you know, like in Venice there, not in Venice, but in Florence, you know, where it goes along there, it's totally exciting.
Yeah.
And we have, that's a place we have an
Who's gonna do it?
opportunity to do something.
So, well, we do. I mean, but you know, the problem I put to you is it going to be a developer? Is it going to be some foreign investor who has uku bucks in order to sort of change the landscape? And what's the role of the government? And what's the role of the community? I mean, one of the problems to me in Hawaii is that the way things work here is everybody has a voice. And when you have so many voices, you have the Tower of Babel, and you can never actually settle on a plan. And it goes on for decades and generations. Who is going to step out? Remember Robert Moses? You know, if we had a Robert Moses, he'd find a way to build this sucker.
Well, even Frank Fosse would find a way.
Yes,
to
that's
do it.
true, and that was
You know,
so good
whether you
about
liked
Fosse.
him or not, if he wanted something done, he would do, even if it took overnight.
Yeah, I
you know.
remember a number of times.
So, but you're right. You get, it's like working with a condominium association. You know, you get 3 people and you'll never get a decision. 2, you got a much better chance. 1, but everyone has their own special interest. And if it's a developer, you know, money is the bottom line, you know. So that's something that would have to be thought out, you know, fairly well. But we really have some good potential there. And we've got the waterways in Chinatown that are, they're just totally, you know, the canals are just totally unused. And sometimes they smell, and sometimes it's just space that's going there waiting to be, you know, and who does it? That's a good question, because that's all state and city and county, I would imagine, because of the, so.
You know, well, the funny thing is, you talk about the waterways and other features, the Laniakea Canal and all this, and we see the possibilities. And from time to time, you know, I remember there was a restaurant on the Laniakea at McCully. Remember that? It was a restaurant with lights at night.
On the corner there,
It was beautiful. That wasn't an expensive public works project either, you know, but it went away. Nobody wanted to return to it. And the government didn't do anything about trying to find another tenant for that area and so forth. And so the question is, you know, who drives the boat here? Who drives and who funds the ideas? And there's really nobody in charge. It's almost like we ought to have a council of architects. I know they could agree on, you know, on special features and special parts of the city. My concern, actually, is that you talk about these water features, Chinatown or the Laniakea and other places too. As we observe them and comment on them, they're getting older. They're becoming less interesting to people. They're fading into obscurity. They're becoming casualties of the growth of the city, and nobody is stepping up to preserve them or develop them. What are we going to do? This is serious, because as the city gets paved over, and those kids, you know, they're looking for interesting, exciting places to brighten up their lives, because they can't afford those $100 million condos. Can't. So
they can't even afford the affordable condos.
That's right. So where are they going to go? What can we offer them? You know, we can't offer them fancy housing. We can't offer them, you know, a great life because they can't make that much money. What we could offer them is public spaces that are interesting and fun, you know, occupy their time in a nutritious way. This is to me, this is a big, you know, requirement right now.
Yeah, well, the hard thing would be separating the money, you know, from the interest.
Yes.
And sometimes you have to do things because it's the right thing to do. I mean, easy for everybody to say that. And again, I keep going back to Scandinavia. I mean, it's part of the whole social urban planning of open space and communities there. And the government really takes part of that. On the islands, in the archipelago, in the Baltic Sea, I think the biggest house you can build is like maybe a 15-foot square. If you want a sauna, you have to get a special permit. If you want a dock, I mean, it's pristine there. The spaces are left open. In the wintertime, the moose walk back and forth between the islands and the mainland, and people ice skate back and forth. It has to be a total concern and a total effort and total planning by everybody. You get one person, a special interest group, and it's not going to end up the way you want it to.
But in Hawaii, I mean, that's what happens. I mean, and Hawaii is kind of a reflection of the mainland in many ways, that tumultuous democracy thing, where money rules. So it's a matter of, you know, and in Scandinavia, it's a 1,000 or 2,000 year tradition already. It's a culture point that you make these spaces for the people. You make a livable city. We haven't gotten to that yet. And it becomes even more critical.
Yeah.
So I guess you know, the problem for me is how do you get the government? I mean, in a theoretical way, how do you get the government to listen? I mean, every member of the government. How do you get the people to shout at the government and say, "Wait, we want to have this"? How do you change the culture?
That's a whole different discussion.
Yeah.
Now you get into politics.
Yeah, sorry.
And politics pretty much determine what gets done in this state.
But what about from the architectural point of view?
Well, the architects have to respond to their clients. I mean, that's who pays the architects. Yeah. And if I were to sit here and if you were to say, if Hugh Hefner or Howard Hughes or one of those Hughes came to me and said, I want to develop Kaka'aka, would I say, no, because you're going to ruin it. I don't want that $100 million condo. You know, so I have to think.
I can just see this conversation.
No, I don't want that job. You know, give it to so-and-so down the street. You know, so money really is, I have to say, it corrupts you, and you have to service your client. Fortunately, I don't get put in that position, so I can say I'm relatively pristine.
Good.
But
that's why you're here.
When you pay the amount of money you pay for land in Hawaii, you know, for a single-family home, you're lucky to have money left over to build a single-family home. And that's why families live together and everything else around here. So, and I think Kaka'ako is a perfect example of what can happen. You know.
Suppose I don't know if this has ever happened, but suppose I made a bill, city or state level, and I said, you know, out of every 100 feet, I want 20 feet, 25 feet, whatever, of public space. You can build whatever you want, but we're reserving, we're gonna have a tamarind park on every block. We're gonna keep it green. And, you know, whatever you want, just remember that when you come in here with your plans, they're gonna have to include that, or no approval.
Yeah, that works until politics get involved again. When I first moved here, they were studying Kaka'ako. What can we do with it? 50 years now, what, you know? And I know when Ward went down there and they built the Ward warehouse and the Ward Center, those were purposely made out of wood and heavy timber with bolts and nuts and brack, because they can be taken down in a week. Somewhat facetious.
Isn't that true?
They were made for future development. They knew that that land was eventually going to be worth a whole lot more than what the zoning allowed them to do now.
Yeah.
The 350-foot height restriction, you know, you give enough somewhere, you can exceed the 350-foot height restriction. You need some density somewhere. It's like emissions. I'm going to sell my emissions to someone else to buy them so I can have more emissions. I'm going to sell my open space to someone else and they can drive out to Kapolei for open space as long as I get my building here. Yeah, so the you know, rules are made to be broken, unfortunately. and
Yeah,
you can
we
find
need a
way
great
around that.
Mahaley. That's what we need. What about cash incentives? This is the flip side of that thing about, you know, the 20%. Suppose I say, look, you build a building like this, we're going to support you. We're going to give you money. We're going to make it easier for you on the economic side if you do public spaces.
Yeah.
Think that would work?
I think it has to come from the top down. I don't think you're going to find too many people on the way up that's going to start giving stuff away. I think it's going to have to be mandatory. For parking spaces, you're required to tree so many parking spaces, and we have to conform to that. And there's a lot of things that we do that are definite benefits. But the open space and how we integrate them, you know, and plan for them and where the money comes from, somewhere we got to bite the, it's like the homeless people. Yeah, we have to do something, but who's going to pay for it?
Ultimately, at the end of the day, Fritz, that's the truth. Yeah, that's
So
the issue.
we'll just raise the taxes some more. You know, we'll extend the rail taxes for another 25 years. We'll extend some more taxes or something. Dog licenses and car licenses and license plates. So we're all going to pay for it.
You heard it here on ThinkTech.
Yeah,
It's
so
it's
much
all
for
a
open
matter of
space, yeah.
economics. Open space and everything else. It's, you know, we did a program on unfunded liabilities last month, $40 billion with no prospect of raising the money. And that wasn't even including open spaces.
Open space, right. It was back up. No, if you travel to some of the most famous cities and fun cities, you know, and the spaces that people go to are the neat public open spaces or that have retained their original vitality that they've learned.
Organic.
Yeah, very organic.
Okay, that's Fritz Johnson, architect, right here in downtown Honolulu, in Chinatown for that matter, here on Community Matters, because it does. And we're talking about public space concepts in anticipation of the program we're going to do, lunch and panel program at the Laniakea on May 21 called Surprise of Surprises, Public Spaces in Hawaii. Thank you, Fritz.
Yeah, thank you. It's been fun.
See you
Totally
then.
enjoyed it.
Aloha.